In September 1941, the German army launched Operation Typhoon, assembling 78 divisions to launch a massive offensive against the Soviet capital, Moscow. The entire western front of the Soviet Union nearly collapsed as the German armored forces advanced rapidly, employing blitzkrieg tactics to push towards Moscow. On this day, Soviet reconnaissance aircraft discovered that the German armored forces had reached the Warsaw Highway, only 190 kilometers from Moscow. At this time, with the Soviet front line in crisis, there were no troops left to deploy in the Moscow region, and the German forces were about to reach the city. In a moment of desperation, the Soviet High Command made a painful decision. They decided to send 3,500 teachers and students from 2 nearby military academies in Podolsk to the battlefield.
Завтрашние командиры. Золотой фонд армии. Через месяц-два они разъедутся по частям и будут защищать...
Полковник Стрельбицкий, кого и что они будут защищать через месяц-два, если немцы завтра утром окажутся в Москве?
The principal was speechless and could only accept the reality. Looking at the cadets, whose average age was only 18 or 19, the principal felt a mix of emotions. As the assembly call sounded, everyone quickly gathered in the central square. Their task was to establish a defensive line on the outskirts of Moscow, to hold off the enemy at all costs until reinforcements arrived. These young men and women, who were immersed in love and training just yesterday, now carried a heroic spirit to kill the enemy for their country, bidding farewell to their loved ones as they prepared for battle. To complete the vanguard mission, a lieutenant led a small team of 500 people to set off first, to establish the first line of defense and buy time. However, on the way, they were suddenly attacked by German warplanes. The cadets hurriedly rushed forward to rescue the supplies, but one of the trucks caught fire. One cadet rushed into the driver's seat to try to drive the vehicle away from the group, but before he could jump out, the vehicle exploded. Before they even reached the battlefield, they had already learned a harsh lesson from the Germans. As night fell, the vanguard continued on and soon arrived at the Warsaw Highway. There, they encountered a few suspicious villagers, and the lieutenant got out to inquire about the situation. However, after a brief conversation, the lieutenant noticed the villagers were armed. The vanguard was suddenly surrounded by armed men hiding in the woods. The atmosphere became tense as both sides prepared for a confrontation. Just as a firefight was about to break out, one of the enemy soldiers noticed something. Fortunately, 2 of the soldiers recognized each other as compatriots. Easing the tension, it turned out they were an intelligence team sent to support the vanguard. They then decided to set an ambush on the Warsaw Highway to catch the German forces by surprise. The next morning, the German armored forces came into view. The cadets, who had been lying in ambush in the woods, quickly loaded armor-piercing shells into their 45mm anti-tank guns. With the lieutenant's command, several German armored vehicles were taken out, exciting the cadets who had destroyed enemy tanks for the first time. The Germans, realizing what was happening, used their MG-34 machine guns to suppress the Soviet forces. Seeing this, the Soviet scouts ordered artillery strikes to destroy the enemy positions. At the same time, the dispersed German forces launched a counterattack from the right flank. One cadet was shot dead immediately, and the intelligence team rushed into the woods to hold off the enemy. One cadet, eager to kill the enemy, left his artillery position and joined the charge. But the next moment, the German's gun jammed. But the cadet, facing the enemy for the first time, hesitated and didn't fire. Seeing this, the German soldier smirked, threw down his gun, and quickly drew a knife. At the critical moment, the intelligence team leader arrived in time and shot the German soldier dead. In the end, 6 cadets sacrificed their lives for a small victory, but this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, on the other side, a large number of cadets, led by the principal, arrived at the first line of defense in Ilyukovo. A group of elderly women was busy digging trenches and constructing defensive works, which angered the principal. The person in charge could only say they were doing their best in response to the principal's anger. The principal sighed deeply, feeling helpless and resigned to fate. At this time, the cadets, new to the battlefield, were unaware of the cruelty of war. Meanwhile, at the forward positions on the Warsaw Highway, German armored forces began to arrive and launched a fierce attack on the Soviet vanguard. At this moment, a Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun hidden in an underground bunker had been waiting for a long time. When the German tanks entered the effective range, the cadets quickly pushed the gun out and fired accurately at the tanks. Facing the fierce attack of the German armored forces, the Soviet vanguard suffered heavy casualties, and the wounded were continuously sent to the field hospital. Seeing that the forward position was about to be overrun, a mixed team of Soviet BT-7 and T-34 tanks arrived just in time. The cadets' morale soared, and with the tank's support, they drove back the Germans. As 68 student IDs were handed to the lieutenant, it meant that 68 more cadets had heroically sacrificed their lives in this battle. Finally, after days of fierce fighting, the vanguard successfully bought valuable time to establish defensive lines for the 3,000 cadets behind them. The rear 3 lines of defense were finally completed, and the heavily damaged vanguard began to withdraw to the main position overnight. A brutal battle for the defense of Moscow was about to begin. The next morning, the Soviet troops in the first line of defense were still asleep when they suddenly heard a loud roar in the sky. By the time they reacted, dozens of German Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers were already overhead. Explosions rang out across the entire Soviet line, and many cadets who couldn't take cover in time were blown away. Without any anti-aircraft weapons, the Soviet forces could only take shelter in the not-so-sturdy trenches and leave their fate to chance. However, just as they breathed a sigh of relief, a second wave of high-altitude bombing followed. A German Heinkel medium bomber, escorted by 3 BM-109 fighters, flew over the Soviet lines. A series of aerial bombs rained down, carpet bombing the area. After the bombing, the entire Soviet line was engulfed in thick smoke, and the dust raised blotted out the sun, creating a hellish scene. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was strewn with corpses and devastation. The medics who hurried to the scene were stunned by the sight of the bodies and didn't know where to start. The soldiers who were lucky to survive were still in shock when the Germans launched a ground attack, supported by tanks. Fortunately, the two 45mm anti-tank guns hidden in the fortress were undamaged. At the commander's order, they fired a heavy volley at the Germans. The position of the first anti-tank gun was discovered by German tanks, and the cadets quickly moved the gun out of the fortress to avoid shelling. After dodging the shells, they quickly moved the gun back into the fortress. At this moment, a German tank was already at the bridge. Fortunately, the second anti-tank gun was ready and quickly aimed. The destroyed tank blocked the bridge, preventing the Germans from advancing, but the position of the second anti-tank gun was also exposed. Seeing this, the cadets quickly moved the gun out of the fortress to continue attacking. However, another German tank had arrived at the bridge, pushing the wrecked tank into the river. As the Germans were about to cross the bridge, the first anti-tank gun, which had evaded the earlier shelling, was ready and destroyed the tank. Seeing that they could not break through the bridge blockade, the Germans decided to retreat. To locate the German base, the intelligence team leader led a few soldiers along the river to scout it. They soon found the German base and identified its coordinates. Upon receiving the precise coordinates, the Soviet command decided to use a secret weapon to teach the Germans a lesson. The next morning, the intelligence team leader and a soldier infiltrated the German base, quietly observing the German officer fishing leisurely. They were waiting for the right moment to capture him. At the same time, the Soviets' new secret weapon had reached the designated position and quickly adjusted its coordinates, targeting the German base. Rows of Katyusha rocket launchers were ready to fire. The intelligence team leader and the soldier rushed out. The leader kicked the German officer to the ground. Meanwhile, the soldier grabbed a pineapple from the table and put it in his pocket, carrying off the confused German cook. To him, a German prisoner was less valuable than a pineapple. Faced with the Katyusha rocket launchers, known as the King of Artillery, the German base was reduced to a scorched wasteland. The Soviet soldiers on the defensive line cheered loudly as they saw the rising smoke in the distance. However, the Germans only paused for a day. They adjusted their tactics and launched another attack on the Soviet line. This time, they first fired a large number of smoke bombs at the Soviet positions to interfere with their vision. Under the cover of the smoke, the Germans began setting up a pontoon bridge and quickly crossed the river. The Soviets, unable to see, could not effectively counterattack. As the Germans got closer, the commander stood up and shouted "Ura!" The soldiers all shouted "Ura!" and charged out of the trenches, engaging in a brutal bayonet fight. A bespectacled clerk, killing the enemy with a gun for the first time, was excited but was knocked to the ground and killed by a German soldier from behind. They may not have had much combat experience, but they were filled with a burning desire to protect their country. In the end, with the Soviets' strong faith and willpower, they once again repelled the Germans and held the first line of defense. Meanwhile, the Sviatka defense line, just 190 kilometers from Moscow, suffered a devastating attack from the Germans. With the coordinated efforts of planes and tanks, the Germans advanced rapidly. However, at the critical moment, the last Soviet anti-tank gun jammed. Seeing that the Germans had broken through the defensive fence, the artillery commander ordered a retreat into the trenches to avoid the shelling, but one artilleryman didn't make it in time. The next second, a cannon blast blew off his legs. The Germans used flamethrowers, burning everything in their path. A soldier, seeing this, quickly picked up a grenade to throw, but the next moment he was engulfed in flames. Despite his agonizing screams, he managed to throw the grenade at the enemy. 3 wounded comrades in the trench witnessed this but were powerless to help. Seeing the German flamethrower operator approaching, a wounded soldier grabbed his rifle and aimed at the enemy, but then German soldiers with submachine guns rushed in. The principal hurried to the rear hospital, which was already overcrowded. From the severely injured cadets, he learned that the Sviatka defense line had fallen, with less than 40 survivors. A nurse, a mother herself, questioned the principal. Faced with her questions, the principal couldn't argue back. He loved his cadets more than anyone, but as a soldier, he could only follow orders. Even without reinforcements, they had to fight to the last man. With the Sviatka defense line lost and no reinforcements in sight, the principal decided to blow up the bridge they were defending. But when 2 soldiers pressed the detonator, they found that the previously laid fuse had been cut by the shelling. A soldier volunteered to sneak into the river at night, disguising himself as a floating corpse to approach the bridge. However, he couldn't avoid the German shots and was injured. Despite the cold and pain, he managed to reconnect the fuse. With a loud explosion, the soldier and the bridge turned to ashes. The principal knew that continuing was meaningless and would only lead to unnecessary sacrifices. But they hadn't received any retreat orders, so the principal gathered all the cadets at the third line of defense, ready to fight the enemy to the last. At that moment, the sound of roaring engines suddenly came from the front. It turned out to be an armored unit coming from the Sviatka direction. The soldiers were overjoyed to see the Soviet flag on the tanks, thinking reinforcements had finally arrived, and they shouted "Euro" while waving to signal the reinforcements. But upon closer inspection, they realized it was the cunning Germans disguised as Soviet tanks. Upon discovering that it was actually German tanks disguised as Soviet ones, the soldiers quickly took up their combat positions to counterattack. In just a few minutes, they destroyed 9 German tanks. However, at that moment, a sudden order for a full retreat came from the command. But facing the advancing German forces, the soldiers at the front lines couldn't withdraw, and many were killed during the retreat. Seeing the German tanks continuously shelling the retreating troops, the wounded lieutenant decided to stay behind to cover the retreat. As they were reloading, Cadet Lavrov suddenly rushed in, deciding to stay with the officer to take down the last 2 German tanks. Lavrov immediately aimed at the second 38D light tank, firing a perfect shot. But as the lieutenant was closing the door, the rope suddenly snapped, exposing their position, and they were quickly spotted by the Germans. However, the armor of the last Panzer III tank was unusually thick, and the armor-piercing shells couldn't penetrate it. The only weak point was the gun barrel. As the 2 aimed at the tank, several grenades were suddenly thrown in. At the critical moment, the 2 exchanged a glance and noticed that the German Panzer III tank had also aimed at them. Lavrov quickly adjusted his aim to the gun barrel. With an explosion, the lieutenant and Lavrov stayed forever on the battlefield. With the arrival of the 17th Tank Brigade as reinforcements, the cadets were evacuated from the battlefield. The mission to hold off the enemy for 5 days turned into a 12-day stand, with these young soldiers, averaging only 18 or 19 years old, using their bodies to build the final defense line for Moscow. Only over 1,000 survived out of the 3,500 teachers and students from the 2 military academies in Podolsk. Their heroic resistance successfully halted the German armored forces' advance along the Warsaw Highway toward Moscow, changing the course of the war. This film is based on true events. The more than 1,000 survivors from the final front were eventually incorporated into the regular army. After World War II, only over 300 teachers and students survived from the entire school. In 1966, they visited the monument together, leaving behind this precious photo with the fallen heroes. I am a movie enthusiast. Thank you for subscribing, and see you next time.